In the scorching deserts of Galilee, on September 3, 1260, an army of former slaves faced the seemingly unstoppable Mongol war machine. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the Mamluks, warriors forged in bondage, disciplined in barracks, and destined to reshape the medieval Islamic world. The Battle of Ayn Jalut would mark the first decisive defeat of the Mongol Empire since its inception under Genghis Khan. From 1250 to 1517, the Mamluk Sultanate stood as the last great Islamic empire of the medieval period. These warrior slaves turned rulers would expel the final Crusaders from the Holy Land, halt Mongol expansion westward, and create one of history's most remarkable political systems, a meritocracy of the sword where slaves could become sultans. Yet their very strength would become their weakness. The same military elite that brought them glory would ultimately drag them toward destruction, as internal strife, economic crisis, and the rise of gunpowder warfare converged to bring down this extraordinary empire. But this moment was more than a military victory. It was the birth announcement of a state that would rule from the Nile to the Euphrates for over 2.5 centuries. This is the story of the rise and fall of the Mamluk state, a tale of triumph, power, and the inexorable forces of historical change. Welcome to Unleash Facts, the place where history secrets, unsolved mysteries, and mind-blowing truths come to light. To understand the Mamluks, we must first journey back to the fractured Islamic world of the 13th century. The year 1258 stands as one of the darkest in Islamic history. Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate and seat of Islamic learning for 5 centuries, lies in ruins. Hulagu Khan's Mongol army has swept through Mesopotamia like a divine punishment. The last Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustasim, meets his end wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses, for Mongol superstition forbids spilling royal blood directly. With him dies not just a man, but the symbolic heart of Sunni Islam. Yet in Cairo, along the life-giving Nile, a different story unfolds. Here, in the shadow of ancient pyramids, a new power stirs. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by the legendary Saladin nearly a century before, totters on the edge of collapse. But from its dying embers, something unprecedented emerges: the Mamluk system. The word Mamluk comes from the Arabic root meaning owned or possessed. These are slave soldiers, but not slaves as we might imagine them. Purchased as boys from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Black Sea region, they undergo a transformation that will reshape the medieval world. Picture a young Circassian boy, perhaps 10 years old, torn from his mountain village by slave traders. His journey ends not in fields or mines, but in the military barracks of Cairo. Here begins an education unlike any other in the medieval world. These boys, Christian, pagan, or nominally Muslim, undergo intensive Islamic education. They learn Arabic, study the Quran, and absorb Islamic law. But their true curriculum is warfare. They master the composite bow, train in horsemanship until horse and rider move as one, and learn the intricate tactics that will make them the finest heavy cavalry of their age. The genius of the Mamluk system lies in its fundamental paradox. These slaves become the military elite precisely because they have no local ties, no tribal affiliations, no divided loyalties. Their only family is their military household, their only loyalty to their master and fellow Mamluks. They are, in essence, the perfect Praetorian Guard. By 1250, the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih Ayyub has assembled the largest and most professional Mamluk regiment ever seen, the Bahriya, named for their barracks on Rhoda Island in the Nile. These will be the men who change history. The Ayyubid system, brilliant in its day, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Saladin's descendants have divided his empire among themselves, weakening it through fraternal strife. The Crusader states still control much of the Levantine coast. The Mongols press ever westward. In this crucible of crisis, the Mamluks will seize their moment. As-Salih Ayyub dies in 1249, and within months, his Mamluk commanders moved to claim power. The most formidable among them is a Turkic warrior named Aybak. But the true architect of Mamluk power is a woman whose story deserves telling, Shajar al-Dur, the Tree of Pearls. The stage is set for one of history's most dramatic power transfers. In the palaces of Cairo, former slaves plot to become kings. In the deserts of Palestine, Mongol hordes advance. In the fortified cities of Outremer, Crusader knights prepare for what they cannot know will be their final chapter. The Mamluk age is about to begin. The transformation from Ayyubid vassals to independent rulers begins with a conspiracy born of desperation and ambition. In 1249, as the Seventh Crusade crashes against the walls of Egyptian resistance, Sultan As-Salih Ayyub lies dying in his palace. His death must be concealed. Revelation would shatter Muslim morale and invite Crusader victory. Enter Shajar al-Dur, a woman whose intelligence and ruthless pragmatism will reshape the Islamic world. Born a Turkic slave, she has risen to become the Sultan's most trusted wife. Now, she orchestrates a deception worthy of Shakespeare. The Sultan's death remains secret, while his Mamluk commanders, led by the fierce Baibars and the ambitious Aybak, crush Louis IX's crusading army at Al-Mansura. King Louis VII of France, Saint Louis, finds himself in chains, his army destroyed by former slaves turned masters of war. The irony tastes bitter on Crusader tongues, the defenders of the faith defeated by those who should be the faithful servants. But the Mamluks face an immediate crisis. The Ayyubid system depends on dynastic legitimacy. As-Salih's heir, Turan Shah, arrives from Mesopotamia, but his attempts to dismiss the Mamluk commanders and install his own men prove fatal, literally. In May 1250, Turan Shah falls to Mamluk daggers during a riverside banquet. The last effective Ayyubid sultan dies as he lived, violently. For 80 days, Shajar al-Dur rules as Sultan of Egypt. She commands armies, issues currency, and leads Friday prayers, remarkable for any medieval ruler, extraordinary for a woman. Her seal bears a telling inscription, Al-Mustar Simiya al-Salihiyya, linking herself to both the Abbasid Caliph and her deceased husband's legitimacy. Yet the medieval Islamic world struggles to accept a woman's rule. The Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad protests. The Ayyubid princes of Syria refuse recognition. Pressure mounts until Shajar al-Dur makes her masterstroke. She marries Aybak, the most powerful Mamluk commander, and transfers nominal power to him while retaining real authority behind the scenes. Aybak's reign from 1250 to 1257 establishes the foundations of Mamluk power, but the system's inherent instability immediately manifests. Shajar al-Dur, discovering Aybak, plans a second marriage to cement Syrian alliances, arranges his murder in 1257. Her Mamluk supporters, horrified by her killing of their commander, beat her to death with wooden clogs in revenge. From this blood-soaked beginning emerges Qutuz, the Mamluk who will face destiny at Ain Jalut. A former prince of Khwarezm enslaved by the Mongols, sold to Egypt and trained as a Mamluk, Qutuz embodies the system's transformative power. The fallen prince becomes the soldier becomes the ruler becomes the savior of Islam. Meanwhile, the Mongol war machine rolls westward with terrifying efficiency. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, has sworn to water his horses in the Mediterranean. After destroying Baghdad and slaughtering its inhabitants, his forces sweep into Syria. Aleppo falls, then Damascus. The local Ayyubid princes either flee or submit. Christian Europe watches in fascination and hope. Could these pagan Mongols complete what centuries of crusades had failed to achieve? Hulagu's forces include Christian contingents, Armenian allies, and Crusader states seeking opportunity in chaos. The possibility of a Mongol Christian alliance against Islam seems tantalizingly real, but in Cairo, Qutuz recognizes the existential threat. These Mongols have never been permanently defeated. They have conquered China, destroyed Khwarezm, toppled Baghdad, and scattered armies like autumn leaves. Their envoys arrive in Cairo with typical Mongol arrogance, demanding surrender. "You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire and have purified the earth of the disorders that tainted it. It is therefore incumbent upon you to send us tribute and place yourself under our command." Qutuz's response electrifies the Islamic world. He executes the Mongol envoys and nails their heads to Cairo's gates. The message rings clear. Egypt will not submit. The last great Islamic power will stand against the Mongol tide, regardless of the consequences. The stage is set for the most consequential battle of the 13th century. Two military systems, two civilizations, two destinies will collide in the hills of Palestine. The Mamluks have seized power, consolidated their rule, and declared their defiance. Now they must prove worthy of the gamble they have taken with the fate of Islam itself. The summer of 1260 brings news that chills Mamluk hearts. Mongol armies have taken Damascus without a fight. The legendary city of the Umayyad Caliphs, Saladin's capital, jewel of Syria, fallen to the descendants of steppe nomads. Worse still, many Muslim commanders have joined the Mongol banner, calculating survival over honor. But fate intervenes with news from the east. The great Khan Munka has died in distant China, summoning Hulegu back to Karakoram for the succession struggle. The Mongol prince leaves only a token force under his lieutenant Kitbuka, still formidable, but no longer invincible. The window of opportunity opens, but only briefly. Qutuz faces the defining moment of Mamluk history. His council divides sharply. Conservative voices urge negotiation, pointing to the Mongols' seemingly supernatural success. Why risk everything against enemies who have conquered half the world? Why not join the winning side, as so many others have done? Yet Qutuz recognizes what his advisors cannot. This moment will never come again. The Mongol army is divided, its main force recalled, its local allies uncertain. If the Mamluks cannot act now, they never will. His declaration becomes legendary. "By Allah, if you fear the Mongols, I do not. I will go forth against them even if no one follows me, that Islam might not say their sultan betrayed them." The decision to fight transforms from military strategy into sacred obligation. Qutuz orders the great drum beaten from the citadel of Cairo, calling the faithful to jihad. Mamluk regiments converge from across Egypt. The response surprises even optimists. Not just Mamluks answer the call, but Ayyubid officers who have preserved their honor, Bedouin tribesmen seeking glory, and regular soldiers inspired by their leaders' courage. More remarkably still, the Frankish Crusader states choose neutrality favorable to the Mamluks. Count Julian of Sidon provides intelligence about Mongol movements. The irony seems almost divine. Crusaders helping Muslims against pagans who might have been their natural allies. Politics trumps religion as medieval pragmatism takes precedence over crusading ideology. The Mamluk army that marches north in July 1260 represents more than military force. It embodies the last hopes of Sunni Islam. These men carry not just weapons, but the weight of civilization itself. Should they fail, the dome of the rock might house Buddhist temples, the Kaaba might echo with shamanist chants, and Arabic might fade like Assyrian and Babylonian before it. Among the commanders rides Baibars al-Bundukdari, the crossbow bearer, a figure who will loom large in our story. Born in Central Asia, enslaved as a boy, trained in Egyptian barracks, Baibars possesses the tactical genius and ruthless ambition that define the Mamluk elite. His relationship with Qutuz mixes loyalty with rivalry. Both men know that survival depends on victory, but only one can claim credit for saving Islam. The terrain favors neither side decisively, but the Mamluks know these hills, while the Mongols fight far from their steppes. More importantly, the psychological burden shifts subtly. The Mongols have become the invaders, the Mamluks, the defenders of their homelands. Sacred geography works its ancient magic on men's hearts. September 3rd, 1260 dawns clear and hot. Both armies form battle lines as the sun climbs toward its zenith. The Mongol formation follows established patterns. Heavy cavalry center, light horse on the flanks, reserves ready to exploit any breakthrough. Their confidence seems justified. This deployment has conquered empires. But the Mamluks have studied Mongol tactics through painful experience. Unlike the armies that fell before them, these former slaves understand their enemies' strengths and weaknesses. They know that Mongol armies depend on momentum, that their feigned retreats draw pursuers into prepared ambushes, that their discipline masks a fundamental weakness. They have never faced enemies who fight with equal skill and superior motivation. As the armies close for battle, history holds its breath. 5 centuries of Islamic civilization hang in the balance. The fate of 3 continents depends on the outcome. In a few hours, either the crescent or the eternal blue sky of Tengri will command from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The spring of Goliath is about to run red with the blood of empires. The Battle of Ayn Jalut begins at dawn, with the ritual of war that has echoed across battlefields since time immemorial. Mongol drums thunder from the hills, their deep resonance answering the battle cries of Mamluk cavalry. But this day will be different from all that came before. Kitbuka deploys his forces according to the tactical genius that has served the Mongol Empire for 60 years. His center forms a steel fist of heavy cavalry, Mongol aristocrats in lamella armor riding their prized war horses. The flanks spread wide with lighter forces designed to envelop and destroy any enemy foolish enough to engage. Behind them, reserves wait to exploit the inevitable breakthrough. This formation has shattered Chinese dynasties, Persian empires, and European kingdoms. Yet Kutuz reveals the first surprise of this legendary day. Rather than meet the Mongol charge directly, he places his army in a defensive crescent behind low hills. The formation appears weak, even cowardly to Mongol eyes, accustomed to enemies who flee before battle is joined. But this perceived weakness masks careful calculation. The initial clash comes when Mongol light cavalry probe the Mamluk flanks, seeking the weakness that always exists in lesser armies. Instead, they meet disciplined volleys from the finest horse archers outside their own ranks. The Mamluks have learned from their enemies. Every tactical innovation, every battlefield technique has been studied, adapted, and improved. What follows defies every precedent in Mongol military history. The Mamluk line bends but does not break. Their cavalry charges meet Mongol attacks with equal fury and superior armor. Most shocking of all, when the Mongols execute their traditional feigned retreat, the Mamluks do not pursue blindly into prepared ambushes. They have studied their enemies too well to fall for familiar deceptions. As morning stretches toward afternoon, something unprecedented occurs. A Mongol army finds itself matched by equals. For the first time since Genghis Khan united the tribes, Mongol advantages in mobility, discipline, and tactics fail to deliver quick victory. The psychological impact reverberates through both armies like physical blows. In the Mamluk ranks, individual heroes emerge to inspire their comrades. Baibars leads a charge that breaks a Georgian regiment, his crossbow earning his nickname as he picks off enemy commanders with deadly precision. Young Mamluks, boys who were slaves 5 years before, fight with the fury of free men defending their chosen homeland. But the battle's turning point comes from an unexpected source. As Mongol pressure threatens the Mamluk right flank, Kutuz makes a decision that reveals his genius. Rather than commit his reserves piecemeal, he leads them personally in a flanking maneuver around the hills that anchor the battlefield. The sight of their sultan charging into battle electrifies the Mamluk army. Here is no distant commander directing from safety, but a warrior king leading from the front. His battle cry echoes across the field. "O Islam! O Islam!" The response from thousands of throats creates thunder that drowns the Mongol war drums. What happens next enters the realm of legend, though witnessed by men on both sides. Kitbuka, seeing his flanks threatened and his center wavering for the first time in his career, commits his reserves in a desperate gamble. The two armies converge in a melee that transforms the battlefield into scenes from Dante's imagination. In single combat that decides the fate of civilizations, Qutuz faces Kitbuka himself. The Mongol general, veteran of 100 victories, meets the former slave who has dared defy the greatest empire in human history. Their duel becomes the focus of thousands of warriors who pause in their own battles to witness this clash of titans. When Kitbuka falls to Qutuz's sword, the psychological balance shifts irrevocably. The Mongol army, undefeated for decades, seemingly favored by heaven itself, breaks like a dam bursting. What began as tactical withdrawal becomes rout, then disaster. The invincible war machine shatters against the determination of men fighting for something greater than conquest. As dust settles over Ain Jalut, the impossible has occurred. Mongol bodies litter the field alongside their Georgian and Armenian allies. The survivors flee eastward, carrying news that will shock the Mongol world. Their armies can be defeated, their expansion can be stopped. Their empire has limits after all. For the Mamluks, victory brings intoxication beyond imagination. They have not merely won a battle, they have saved Islam, preserved Arabic civilization, and announced their arrival as a great power. The boy slaves have become the champions of the faith, their sultan the sword of Allah himself. But triumph contains the seeds of tragedy. As the victorious army celebrates, Baibars approaches his commander with congratulations that mask deeper intentions. The crossbow bearer has fought magnificently, but his eyes already calculate beyond this day's glory. One victory does not make an empire, and empires require emperors, not merely generals. The spring of Goliath has indeed seen another giant fall. But like all great victories, this one will demand a price that few can imagine. The Mamluks have won their independence through force of arms. Now they must learn whether they can govern as skillfully as they fight, whether former slaves can build lasting institutions, whether their military genius can translate into political wisdom. History pivots on this moment of triumph and potential. The fate of the medieval world has shifted, but toward what destiny remains unclear. Victory at Ain Jalut echoes across the medieval world like thunder from a clear sky. In Baghdad's ruins, surviving scholars dare to hope that the Mongol night might end. In Constantinople, Byzantine emperors recalculate alliances with these unexpected champions of Islam. In Rome, Pope Alexander IV receives news with mixed emotions. Pagan Mongols have fallen, but to Muslim hands that might prove equally threatening to Christian interests. Yet triumph breeds its own complications. As the Mamluk army returns to Cairo, bearing Kitbuka's severed head and Mongol battle standards, underlying tensions explode into violence that will define the Sultanate's character forever. The assassination comes without warning. On October 24, 1260, near the Egyptian border, Baibars and his co-conspirators strike down Qutuz during what appears to be a celebratory hunt. The crossbow bearer's blade finds its mark with the same precision he showed against Mongol commanders. The man who saved Islam dies at the hands of his own officers, victim of the very ambition that had driven Mamluk success. This act of regicide establishes a pattern that will haunt the Mamluk Sultanate throughout its existence. Military prowess creates sultans, but the same warrior culture that produces heroes also breeds conspirators. The skills that make excellent generals, ruthless ambition, tactical thinking, personal loyalty to military households, prove less suitable for stable governance. Baibars claims the throne as Al-Malik Az-Zahir, the victorious king. His reign from 1260 to 1277 transforms the Mamluk state from desperate defender into aggressive conqueror. Where Qutuz saved Islam, Baibars expands it. Where his predecessor fought defensively, the new sultan strikes offensively with calculation and brutality that earn him legendary status among both admirers and enemies. The strategic situation demands immediate action. Mongol forces regroup in eastern Syria, while Crusader states opportunistically expand their territories. Baibars recognizes that the Mamluk's survival depends not on holding defensive lines, but on eliminating all potential threats through systematic conquest. His first target surprises many observers, not the weakened Mongols, but the fragmented Crusader states. This decision reveals Baibars' strategic genius. The Frankish principalities, divided among themselves and dependent on European reinforcements, represent easier prey than Mongol armies. More importantly, their coastal fortresses provide bases from which future crusades might launch, and their territories offer economic prizes worth the conquest. The siege of Antioch in 1268 demonstrates the evolution of Mamluk military power. Founded in 1098 as one of the original Crusader states, Antioch has withstood Muslim attacks for 170 years. Its massive walls and strategic position have made it seemingly impregnable. Yet Baibars appears before its gates with innovations that transform medieval warfare. His army includes not just the elite Mamluk cavalry that won at Ain Jalut, but professional siege engineers, many of them former subjects of fallen cities who served their new masters with technical expertise. Chinese siege techniques, learned from captured Mongol specialists, combine with Islamic military engineering and Byzantine architectural knowledge. The result devastates traditional defensive thinking. Baibars employs psychological warfare with systematic precision. His letters to Crusader commanders mix diplomatic courtesy with chilling threats. To Bohemond the Sycophant of Antioch, he writes, "Death has sought you out in his many forms. You would have seen your knights prostrate beneath horses' hooves, your houses stormed by pillagers, your women sold 4 at a time and bought with a dinar of your own money." When Antioch falls after a brief siege, Baibars orders the systematic slaughter of its population, men, women, and children. Contemporary sources describe scenes that shock even medieval sensibilities accustomed to warfare's brutality. The Sultan's message resonates across the remaining Crusader territories: surrender immediately or face complete annihilation. This policy of calculated terror proves devastatingly effective. Crusader fortress after fortress opens its gates rather than endure Antioch's fate. The great castle of Crac de Chevalier, jewel of Hospitaller military architecture, surrenders in 1271 after minimal resistance. By 1277, Frankish presence in the Holy Land has shrunk to a handful of coastal enclaves, clinging to existence through Mamluk sufferance rather than military strength. But Baibars proves more than a destroyer. He builds as efficiently as he conquers. The Mamluk state that emerges under his rule establishes governmental structures that will endure for centuries. The Ikta system distributes conquered lands among military commanders, creating a feudal hierarchy that ensures both loyalty and efficiency. Tax farming provides steady revenues while maintaining local administrative structures. Most importantly, Baibars institutionalizes the Mamluk military system. Young slaves arrive from Caucasian markets in unprecedented numbers. The barracks of Cairo, Damascus, and other major cities become academies of war that produce the finest heavy cavalry in the medieval world. Each new generation of Mamluks receives better training, superior equipment, and more systematic education than their predecessors. The postal system Barid that Baibars creates rivals anything in medieval Europe or Asia. Intelligence networks stretch from Anatolia to Nubia, providing the Sultan with information advantages that prove decisive in diplomatic and military planning. His spies penetrate Mongol courts, crusader councils, and rival Muslim territories with systematic thoroughness. By his death in 1277, Baibars has transformed a desperate coalition of former slaves into the dominant power of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Mamluk Sultanate controls Egypt, most of Syria, and parts of Anatolia. Its armies have never suffered major defeat. Its territories generate wealth that funds continued expansion. Its enemies, Mongol, Crusader, and Muslim rival alike, treat it with respect bordering on fear. Yet success contains contradictions that will eventually doom the system Baibars has created. The very military excellence that ensures Mamluk dominance also creates competition among commanders that periodically erupts into civil war. The slave recruitment system that provides superior soldiers also isolates the ruling class from their subjects. The territorial expansion that brings wealth also creates administrative burdens that strain governmental capacity. The crossbow bearer has built magnificently, but on foundations that time will prove less solid than they appear at this moment of triumph. The early 14th century witnesses the Mamluk Sultanate reach heights that would have seemed impossible to the desperate defenders of 1260. Under the long reign of Al-Nasir Muhammad ibn Qalawun, ruling intermittently from 1294 to 1341, the empire that began with former slaves transforms into the greatest power of the medieval Islamic world. But this golden age emerges from chaos that nearly destroys everything Baibars built. The decades following the crossbow bearer's death see the Sultanate convulsed by succession crises that reveal the inherent instability of a system where military prowess determines legitimacy. Sultans rise and fall with bewildering frequency, 9 rulers in 17 years, each claiming power through force of arms rather than hereditary right. The pattern becomes grimly predictable. A successful military commander seizes the throne, rules effectively until his death, then watches his empire fragment as rival Mamluks contest succession. The very warrior culture that creates effective rulers also prevents stable transitions of power. Each generation must reconquer what their predecessors won. Al-Nasir Muhammad's first reign in 1294 lasts only 2 years before more powerful emirs overthrow him. His second reign from 1299 to 1309 sees him gradually accumulate real authority while nominally serving under regent control. But his third and longest reign, beginning in 1310, demonstrates how a skilled ruler can transform the Mamluk system's weaknesses into sources of strength. The key lies in al-Nasir's recognition that sustainable power requires more than military victory. Where his predecessors relied primarily on force, he builds a governmental structure that systematically channels Mamluk ambitions toward imperial rather than personal goals. The Iqta system undergoes systematic reform, creating incentives for loyalty while punishing rebellious behavior through economic pressure rather than constant warfare. His architectural projects advertise Mamluk power while providing practical benefits that win popular support. The great mosque and madrasa complex that bears his name in Cairo rivals the finest achievements of earlier Islamic dynasties. Its geometric patterns, soaring minarets, and innovative architectural techniques demonstrate that former slaves can patronize culture as magnificently as any traditional aristocracy. But al-Nasir's greatest triumph lies in diplomacy, the systematic transformation of the Mamluk Sultanate from a regional power into the acknowledged leader of the Islamic world. His embassies reach from Spain to Central Asia, carrying messages that position Cairo as the new center of Sunni orthodoxy, now that Baghdad lies in ruins. The relationship with the surviving Abbasid caliphs, relocated to Cairo after the Mongol destruction of their ancestral seat, provides religious legitimacy that earlier Mamluk rulers lacked. By positioning himself as the protector and patron of the caliphate, al-Nasir transforms military usurpation into religious duty. The former slave becomes the defender of the faith, his reign blessed by the successes of the Prophet himself. Economic prosperity reaches unprecedented levels during this period. The Mamluk Sultanate controls crucial trade routes between Asia and Europe, generating customs revenues that fund both military expansion and cultural achievement. Venetian and Genoese merchants compete for access to eastern spices and silk that flow through Alexandrian ports. The wealth that built the pyramids now funds a new Egyptian golden age. In the workshops of Cairo and Damascus, artisans perfect techniques that will influence Islamic art for centuries. Mamluk metalwork, with its intricate inlay patterns and calligraphic inscriptions, sets standards that later craftsmen struggle to equal. Manuscript illumination reaches heights of geometric complexity and aesthetic refinement that reflect both Persian influences and indigenous innovation. The great historian al-Makrizi, writing during this period, captures the Sultanate's self-confidence. Cairo has become the metropolis of the universe, the garden of the world, the nursery of the human species, the gateway of Islam, and the seat of power. His words reflect not merely patriotic boasting, but observable reality. Few medieval cities can match Cairo's combination of political power, economic vitality, and cultural achievement. Military development continues apace, with innovations that maintain Mamluk superiority over potential rivals. The famous Mamluk composite bow undergoes systematic improvement, achieving range and accuracy that amazes foreign observers. Training regimens produce cavalry whose skill in mounted archery exceeds even Mongol standards. Individual Mamluks become living weapons whose value in battle justifies enormous investment in their education and equipment. Yet al-Nasir's most significant achievement may be his successful management of the Mongol threat. The Ilkhanate of Persia, established by Hulagu's descendants, continues to press westward through intermittent warfare that tests Mamluk resolve. But rather than meeting this challenge through purely military means, al-Nasir employs a sophisticated combination of diplomacy, economic pressure, and selective force that gradually wears down Mongol capabilities. The conversion of the Ilkhan Ghazan to Islam in 1295 creates opportunities for diplomatic engagement that did not exist during the pagan period. Muslim Mongols find it harder to justify holy war against the defenders of the faith, while internal Persian politics provide openings that skilled Mamluk diplomats exploit with ruthless efficiency. The Battle of Wadi al-Khazandar in 1299 demonstrates both Mamluk vulnerabilities and their capacity for recovery. Ghazan's invasion of Syria initially succeeds, routing Mamluk forces and occupying Damascus. For a brief moment, the Mongol dream of reaching the Mediterranean seems achievable, but the Mamluks' systematic approach to warfare shows its value in crisis. Rather than accept defeat, al-Nasir reorganizes his forces, strikes back decisively, and drives the invaders eastward once more. More significantly, this temporary defeat teaches valuable lessons about military adaptation. The Mamluks begin incorporating gunpowder weapons, primitive cannon, and early firearms into their traditional cavalry-based tactics. While these innovations remain secondary to their proven strengths, they demonstrate the intellectual flexibility that distinguishes great military systems from merely successful ones. By 1320, the Mongol threat has essentially ended. The Ilkhanate fragments into competing successor states, its unity shattered by the same succession crises that periodically convulse the Mamluk Sultanate. The difference lies in institutional resilience. Where Mongol political structures depend entirely on personal authority, the Mamluk system has developed governmental mechanisms that survive individual rulers. The intellectual life of al-Nasir's reign reflects broader patterns of Islamic revival and innovation. The House of Wisdom tradition, nearly destroyed by the Mongol sack of Baghdad, finds new expression in Cairene academies and libraries. Scholars from across the Islamic world gather in the Mamluk capital, creating a cosmopolitan intellectual environment that rivals the great centers of earlier centuries. Ibn Taymiyyah, the influential theologian, develops his reformist interpretation of Islamic law, partly in response to Mamluk patronage and partly in reaction to the syncretic tendencies he observes in contemporary religious practice. His emphasis on returning to pristine Islamic sources reflects broader cultural currents within the Sultanate, a society of former slaves seeking authentic Islamic identity through rigorous scholarship and practice. The madrasas that proliferate during this period serve multiple functions beyond religious education. They provide career paths for ambitious young men who lack military aptitude, create networks of scholarly authority that complement governmental power, and establish intellectual frameworks that help legitimize Mamluk rule among educated populations. In the bustling markets of Cairo, prosperity creates social mobility unknown in more rigid medieval societies. Artisan families accumulate wealth through skilled craftsmanship, merchant networks extend from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, and religious scholars achieve influence that rivals military commanders. The Mamluk system's meritocratic elements extend beyond the military sphere into civilian society. Yet this golden age contains contradictions that will eventually prove fatal. The very prosperity that enables cultural achievement also creates economic dependencies that make the Sultanate vulnerable to external disruption. When European navigators discover oceanic routes to Asian markets, bypassing traditional Middle Eastern intermediaries, the fiscal foundations of Mamluk power will begin to erode. Similarly, the military excellence that ensures continued dominance becomes increasingly expensive to maintain. Each generation of Mamluks requires more sophisticated training, better equipment, and higher compensation than their predecessors. The costs of maintaining military superiority grow exponentially, while revenue sources remain essentially static. As al-Nasir's reign draws to its close in 1341, the Mamluk Sultanate stands at its historical zenith. From the Nile to the Euphrates, from Anatolia to Nubia, Mamluk authority commands respect and obedience. The black banners bearing Islamic inscriptions fly over territories that would have seemed impossible dreams to the desperate defenders of Ain Jalut. Yet the seeds of decline have already been planted. The succession crisis that follows al-Nasir's death will demonstrate once more that the Mamluk system's greatest strength, its meritocratic selection of leaders through military competition, also constitutes its greatest weakness. The very warrior culture that creates effective rulers also prevents stable transitions of power. The Golden Age reaches its sunset, though few contemporary observers recognize the approaching darkness. The Sultanate that rose through military excellence will discover whether it can adapt to changing circumstances or whether success itself has created the conditions for ultimate failure. While the Mamluk Sultanate reaches unprecedented heights under al-Nasir Muhammad, the final act of the Crusader drama plays out along the Mediterranean coast. The Christian principalities that once stretched from Antioch to Gaza have shrunk to isolated fortresses, clinging to existence through a combination of Mamluk tolerance, European subsidies, and sheer stubbornness. Acre, the last great Crusader stronghold, presents a paradox that illuminates the complexity of medieval international relations. This bustling port city hosts Christian pilgrims, Muslim merchants, and European crusaders in an atmosphere of pragmatic coexistence that would have amazed the zealots who launched the First Crusade 2 centuries earlier. The city's population reflects this cosmopolitan reality. Frankish nobles preside over Arabic-speaking Christian subjects who have lived under Muslim rule for generations. Italian merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa maintain trading posts that handle commerce with both Christian Europe and the Islamic world. Even Mamluk officials conduct business within Acre's walls, their presence testament to economic imperatives that transcend religious boundaries. Yet this peaceful coexistence masks underlying tensions that will soon explode into final violence. The arrival of European crusaders, filled with traditional anti-Muslim fervor and unaware of local complexities, disrupts delicate balances maintained through decades of careful diplomacy. These fresh warriors view any accommodation with Islam as betrayal, any compromise as weakness. The incident that triggers the end comes in 1290 with tragic predictability. Recently arrived Italian crusaders, inspired by papal calls for renewed holy war, attack Muslim merchants and pilgrims in Acre's streets. The massacre violates every treaty and custom that has preserved the peace, but more importantly, it provides Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil with the justification he needs for final action. The Mamluk Sultan faces a strategic decision that will echo through history. For decades, the remaining Crusader cities have posed minimal military threat while providing useful economic benefits. Their destruction would eliminate potential bases for future European expeditions, but it would also disrupt profitable trade relationships and remove a valuable source of customs revenue. Al-Ashraf's choice reflects both practical calculation and symbolic necessity. The massacre at Acre cannot go unpunished without appearing weak to his own military commanders. More importantly, the complete expulsion of the Franks would achieve what Saladin himself had failed to accomplish: the total liberation of the Holy Land from Christian occupation. The siege preparations reveal how dramatically military technology has evolved since the early Crusades. The Mamluk army that appears before Acre in April 1291 includes the largest concentration of siege engines ever assembled in the medieval Middle East. Mangonels, trebuchets, and early gunpowder weapons create a technological arsenal that no medieval fortification can withstand indefinitely. But the true innovation lies not in individual weapons, but in systematic application of siege warfare principles learned from decades of campaign experience. Chinese military engineers, originally captured from Mongol armies, provide expertise in undermining techniques that had toppled the walls of Beijing. Islamic mathematical knowledge contributes to ballistic calculations that maximize artillery effectiveness. Byzantine architectural understanding reveals weakness in fortification designs. The bombardment begins on May 5, 1291, and continues with relentless intensity for 43 days. Contemporary chronicles describe the psychological impact of constant artillery fire, the thunderous noise that prevents sleep, the random destruction that makes no place safe, the growing realization that medieval stone walls cannot protect against modern military science. Within Acre's walls, the final drama of the Crusader era unfolds with tragic grandeur. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights prepare to die as they have lived, in service to their Christian ideal. These warrior monks, descendants of men who carved kingdoms from Muslim territories, face annihilation with the stoic courage that has defined their entire existence. Henry II of Cyprus, nominal king of Jerusalem, recognizes the hopelessness of the situation and evacuates to safety before the final assault. His departure symbolizes more than personal survival. It represents the abandonment of the Crusader project by its own leadership. The kings of Jerusalem flee their kingdom, leaving commoners and monks to die for a cause their rulers no longer believe winnable. The final assault comes at dawn on May 18th. Mamluk forces pour through breaches in the walls that artillery has blasted open during weeks of bombardment. What follows adheres to the brutal customs of medieval siege warfare. A city that resists to the end faces no mercy in defeat. Yet individual acts of heroism illuminate the darkness. The master of the temple, William of Beaujeu, dies defending the breach in the walls, his body found among piles of Mamluk and Christian dead. Common soldiers, many of them local Christians who have never seen Europe, fight alongside European knights with desperate courage that earns even their enemies' respect. The Templar Tower, last refuge of the defenders, holds out for 10 additional days after the city falls. When it finally collapses, whether from Mamluk mining or structural failure, it crushes attackers and defenders alike in a pile of rubble that contemporary observers interpret as divine judgment on the futility of religious warfare. With Acre's fall, 2 centuries of crusader presence in the Holy Land ends not with dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but with systematic demolition. Al-Ashraf orders the complete destruction of all coastal fortifications to prevent future European expeditions from establishing footholds. The great castles that had dominated the Palestinian landscape for generations disappear stone by stone, their materials recycled into mosques and madrasas. The evacuation that follows demonstrates both medieval logistics capabilities and the deep roots that Frankish settlers had established. Ships carry away not just European nobles and knights, but entire communities, Arabic-speaking Christians whose families had lived in the Holy Land for generations, artisans whose skills had flourished under Crusader patronage, merchants whose networks connected 3 continents. The human cost extends beyond military casualties to include the displacement of populations whose only crime was backing the losing side. These refugees scatter across the Mediterranean, carrying with them the languages, customs, and memories of the experiment in religious colonialism that ultimately failed. For the Mamluk Sultanate, victory brings strategic satisfaction, but also unexpected challenges. The elimination of external enemies removes a unifying threat that had helped maintain internal cohesion. Without Crusader strongholds to capture or Mongol armies to repel, Mamluk military energy increasingly turns inward, creating the factional struggles that will eventually weaken the system from within. More immediately, the economic disruption caused by destroying profitable trading centers creates fiscal pressures that will compound over time. The Mamluks have achieved total military victory, but at costs that will prove higher than anyone anticipates. The cross no longer flies over the Holy Land, but the crescent's triumph comes at the moment when new challenges, technological, economic, and political, are emerging to test whether military excellence alone can sustain imperial power in a changing world. The elimination of external threats exposes a fundamental weakness in the Mamluk system that had previously remained hidden beneath the urgency of survival. Without Mongol armies pressing from the east or Crusader strongholds threatening from the coast, the warrior energy that had united the Sultanate in common cause increasingly turns inward, creating conflicts that will poison Mamluk politics for generations. The death of al-Nasir Muhammad in 1341 triggers a succession crisis that reveals how little the Sultanate has resolved its central political dilemma. Despite 4 decades of strong rule, no institutional mechanism exists for peaceful transition of power. The military household system that produces excellent warriors proves incapable of selecting rulers through any means other than force. What follows reads like a chronicle of systematic dysfunction. Between 1341 and 1382, 24 sultans claimed the throne, few of them surviving more than a handful of years. The average reign lasts less than 2 years, with some rulers lasting mere months or even weeks before rivals eliminate them through assassination, deposition, or battlefield defeat. This political instability stems from contradictions built into the Mamluk system from its inception. The military households that provide the Sultanate's strength also create permanent factional divisions that no individual ruler can fully control. Each great emir commands personal loyalty from Mamluks who owe their careers, their wealth, and their lives to his patronage. These bonds transcend loyalty to any sultan, creating parallel power structures that compete for dominance. The ethnic divisions that had once provided the system's strength now become sources of weakness. Turkish Mamluks, dominant since the early days, face increasing challenges from Circassian newcomers who bring fresh military skills and unburdened ambitions. The Turks claim precedence based on their historical role in establishing Mamluk power, while the Circassians argue for advancement based on current military contributions. These ethnic tensions intersect with generational conflicts that further complicate political dynamics. Older Mamluks, veterans of great victories against Mongols and Crusaders, resist younger warriors who lack their combat experience but possess superior training in evolving military technologies. Each generation views the other with suspicion, the veterans seeing dangerous inexperience, the newcomers perceiving obsolete thinking. The reign of Al-Salih Ismail in 1342 to 1345 illustrates how quickly political divisions can escalate into civil war. Initially supported by a coalition of Turkish emirs who view him as a malleable puppet, Ismail attempts to assert real authority by playing Circassian factions against his Turkish sponsors. The result devastates the Sultanate's administrative efficiency and military readiness. Battles erupt not just in the palace corridors of Cairo, but across the provinces as rival factions struggle for control of revenue-producing territories. The Ikuta system, designed to ensure loyalty through economic incentives, becomes a source of conflict as each new ruler redistributes lands to reward supporters and punish enemies. Agricultural production suffers as farmers abandon fields to avoid being caught between competing armies. The great emir Yalbuga al-Umari emerges as the dominant figure of the mid-14th century, exercising power behind a succession of nominal sultans whom he installs and removes at will. His assassination in 1366 by rivals who fear his growing authority triggers another round of factional warfare that paralyzes governmental functions for months at a time. Within the palace complex of Cairo, politics becomes a deadly game where survival depends on reading constantly shifting alliances with perfect accuracy. Emirs maintain elaborate intelligence networks to monitor rival activities, while sultans employ food tasters and bodyguards whose loyalty must be continually tested and rewarded. The harem emerges as an unexpected center of political influence, as royal women forge alliances that transcend the male military hierarchies. Mothers of young sultans, sisters of powerful emirs, and wives of ambitious commanders create informal networks that sometimes prove more durable than official governmental structures. Yet these political struggles occur against a backdrop of continued external success that masks their debilitating effects. Mamluk armies continue winning victories against remaining external enemies: Mongol successor states, Anatolian beyliks, and Armenian kingdoms. The military machine functions effectively despite political chaos, testament to the professional training that makes individual Mamluks formidable regardless of their commander's competence. The economic costs of internal warfare prove more damaging than military expenses. Trade disruptions caused by factional fighting reduce customs revenues that fund the Sultanate's operations. European merchants, essential for the prosperity that underwrites Mamluk power, increasingly seek alternative routes and partners as Egyptian politics becomes unpredictably violent. The fiscal pressures create a vicious cycle that compounds political instability. Reduced revenues force sultans to extract more resources from their subjects through increased taxation, creating popular resentment that ambitious rivals can exploit. Meanwhile, the need to maintain military expenditures, despite declining income, forces dangerous choices between military effectiveness and administrative competence. Debasement of currency becomes a regular governmental practice as rulers seek to fund immediate needs without regard for long-term consequences. The silver content of Mamluk coins declines steadily throughout this period, creating inflation that particularly impacts urban populations who support the Sultanate needs for stability. The intellectual and cultural achievements of the Golden Age suffer as patronage becomes increasingly sporadic and politicized. Scholars and artists find their careers dependent not on merit or achievement, but on backing the correct political faction. The great building projects that had advertised Mamluk power cease as resources are diverted to military expenditures and factional bribes. The madrasas that had flourished under earlier rulers struggle to maintain quality education as their endowments are confiscated by competing political factions. The scholarly networks that had connected Cairo to the broader Islamic world weaken as travel becomes dangerous and communications unreliable. Yet creativity persists despite political chaos. The distinctive Mamluk artistic style reaches full maturity during this period as craftsmen develop techniques that will influence Islamic art for centuries. The famous Mamluk carpets, metalwork, and manuscript illumination achieve aesthetic heights that reflect both cultural confidence and political anxiety. Most dangerously, the factional struggles begin affecting military efficiency as personal loyalties override professional standards. Mamluk units refuse to serve under commanders from rival factions, creating coordination problems that reduce battlefield effectiveness. The elite training that had made individual Mamluks superior to any contemporary soldiers becomes less relevant when they cannot cooperate effectively in large-scale operations. The recruitment and training of new Mamluks suffers as political instability disrupts the systematic processes that had maintained military quality for generations. Young slaves receive inconsistent education as their instructors are frequently reassigned due to political considerations rather than pedagogical competence. By 1380, the Mamluk Sultanate remains formidable by medieval standards, but internal contradictions have created vulnerabilities that acute observers can perceive. The system that produced the victors of Ain Jalut and the conquerors of Acre has become its own worst enemy, consuming energy in internal struggles that would be better directed toward emerging external challenges. The rise of the Ottoman Empire to the north, the expansion of European maritime power, and the gradual shift of global trade routes away from traditional Middle Eastern pathways create strategic pressures that will require united responses. Whether the fractured Mamluk political system can provide such unity remains an open question. The sword that had defended Islam for over a century now cuts primarily at itself. The Sultanate enters its final phase, weakened by success, divided by victory, and vulnerable to challenges that will demand the very unity that internal warfare has made impossible. As the 15th century dawns, a new shadow falls across the Mamluk Sultanate from the north, the expanding Ottoman Empire, whose green banners advance steadily through Anatolia toward the very heartlands of Islamic civilization. What begins as a distant threat gradually becomes an existential challenge that will test every assumption upon which Mamluk power has been built. The Ottomans present a fundamentally different model of Islamic governance that implicitly challenges Mamluk legitimacy. Where the Sultanate relies on a military elite of foreign slaves, the Ottomans build their power on Turkish tribal foundations, strengthened by systematic recruitment of Christian youth through the Devshirme system. Where Mamluk rule depends on factional competition among rival military households, Ottoman authority flows from a unified dynastic structure that provides stable succession mechanisms. Most troubling from the Mamluk perspective, Ottoman military innovations threaten to make traditional cavalry-based warfare obsolete. The same gunpowder weapons that the Mamluks had adopted as supplements to their proven tactics become the foundation of Ottoman military doctrine. Janissary infantry armed with firearms can devastate charging cavalry in ways that no medieval army had previously imagined possible. The first serious Ottoman-Mamluk conflicts emerge in the borderlands of southeastern Anatolia, where both empires seek control over territories that had traditionally belonged to neither. These initial clashes, fought between 1485 and 1491 during the reign of Sultan Qaitbay, revealed disturbing trends that few Mamluk observers fully comprehend. Mamluk cavalry, the finest heavy horsemen in the medieval world, find themselves systematically outmaneuvered by Ottoman combined arms tactics that integrate firearms, artillery, and traditional weapons into unified battlefield systems. The individual superiority of Mamluk warriors, so decisive in earlier conflicts, becomes less relevant when facing disciplined formations that fight as coordinated units rather than collections of heroes. Even more concerning, Ottoman victories demonstrate logistical capabilities that surpass traditional Islamic military systems. The Turks maintain supply lines across hundreds of miles, coordinate multiple army corps with precision timing, and sustain military operations through winter campaigns that would exhaust most medieval forces. Their military machine operates with systematic efficiency that recalls Mongol organization adapted to gunpowder warfare. Sultan Qaitbay, the ablest Mamluk ruler of the late period, recognizes the severity of the challenge and attempts systematic military reforms designed to address Ottoman advantages. His reign from 1468 to 1496 represents the Sultanate's last serious attempt to adapt its fundamental structures to changing strategic realities. The artillery corps that Qaitbay establishes reflects both Mamluk determination and the system's inherent limitations. While the Sultanate can purchase or manufacture firearms comparable to Ottoman weapons, it struggles to integrate these technologies into existing military doctrine. Mamluk identity remains fundamentally tied to mounted archery and individual combat prowess, values that seem increasingly irrelevant in an age of massed gunfire. More problematically, the social structures that produce excellent traditional warriors prove unsuitable for training effective gunpowder infantry. The Mamluk system selects for personal courage, individual skill, and loyalty to military households, characteristics that matter less when success depends on disciplined formation, fighting, and subordination to centralized command structures. The Ottomans prove as innovative in economic warfare as in military tactics. Their control over Anatolian trade routes allows them to disrupt the commercial networks that fund Mamluk power, while simultaneously enriching their own treasuries. The systematic way they exploit these advantages reveals strategic thinking that extends far beyond traditional military concerns. The Siege of Rhodes in 1480, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrates Ottoman capabilities that terrify observers throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The logistical effort required to transport and maintain a siege army on an island fortress, combined with artillery techniques that reduce supposedly impregnable fortifications to rubble, announces that a new era of warfare has begun. For the Mamluks, the implications extend beyond immediate military threats. If the Ottomans can project power across water barriers and maintain siege operations indefinitely through systematic supply management, then no Mamluk territory remains truly secure. The strategic depth that had protected Egypt from northern invasions since ancient times may no longer provide adequate security. The rise of Ottoman power creates diplomatic challenges that strain traditional Mamluk alliance systems. European powers, faced with Turkish expansion into the Balkans, seek Muslim allies who might serve as counterweights to Ottoman ambitions. Yet the same Europeans continue viewing all Islamic states as natural enemies, making coherent anti-Ottoman coalitions politically impossible. The Safavid rise in Persia adds another layer of complexity to regional politics. The new Shia dynasty that seizes power in Iran after 1501 creates a natural Ottoman enemy, but also represents a heretical threat to Sunni orthodoxy that the Mamluks officially champion. Should the Sultanate ally with Shia Persians against Sunni Turks, or maintain religious unity at the cost of strategic disadvantage? Qaitbay's diplomatic correspondence with European monarchs reveals the Sultanate's growing desperation. Letters to the Pope and various Christian kings propose anti-Ottoman alliances based on shared opposition to Turkish expansion, despite centuries of Christian-Muslim hostility. The offers receive polite responses, but no substantial support. European powers prefer to see Islamic states weaken each other rather than risk strengthening any Muslim power. The external pressures created by Ottoman expansion exacerbate existing internal divisions within the Mamluk system. Military households split between those advocating accommodation with Turkish power and those demanding resistance, regardless of consequences. The ethnic divisions between Turkish and Circassian Mamluks acquire new significance as the Turkish faction faces accusations of potential disloyalty to non-Turkish rulers. The fiscal strains imposed by military competition with the Ottomans force increasingly desperate financial measures. Tax increases necessary to fund military modernization create popular resentment that ambitious rivals can exploit. The debasement of currency accelerates as sultans choose immediate military needs over long-term economic stability. Perhaps most damaging, the obvious success of Ottoman military methods creates doubts about fundamental Mamluk assumptions regarding warfare and governance. If Turkish innovations prove superior to traditional Islamic military practices, what other aspects of the system might require radical revision? The psychological impact of acknowledging organizational inferiority proves almost as devastating as military defeats. Yet the Mamluk response reveals both adaptive capacity and cultural constraints that will ultimately prove decisive. While the Sultanate adopts gunpowder weapons and experiments with new tactical formations, it cannot abandon the cultural values that give the system its identity without destroying the foundations of its authority. The military training that produces individual warriors of extraordinary skill becomes a liability in warfare that demands mass discipline over personal heroism. The honor codes that inspire magnificent individual courage prove counterproductive when success requires subordinating personal glory to collective effectiveness. The very sources of Mamluk strength become obstacles to necessary adaptation. By 1500, the strategic balance in the Eastern Mediterranean has shifted decisively against Mamluk interests. The Sultanate remains formidable by traditional standards. Its territories still generate substantial wealth. Its armies still win occasional victories. Its cultural achievements still command respect throughout the Islamic world. But the Ottomans have demonstrated military and organizational capabilities that surpass anything the medieval Islamic world has previously seen. Their systematic approach to warfare, government, and economics suggests that they represent not just another competing dynasty, but a fundamentally different approach to Islamic power that may render traditional systems obsolete. The question facing the Mamluk Sultanate is no longer whether it can maintain its historical dominance, but whether it can adapt quickly enough to survive at all. The sword of Islam faces a new challenger whose weapons and methods threaten to make traditional heroism irrelevant. The twilight of the Mamluk age has begun, though its final darkness still lies ahead. While Mamluk armies grapple with Ottoman military innovations, deeper forces undermine the very foundations of Sultanate power. The economic systems that had sustained centuries of political dominance faced disruption from sources that traditional statecraft cannot address. Technological revolutions occurring thousands of miles away that will ultimately prove more decisive than any battlefield defeat. The Portuguese discovery of sea routes to the Indian Ocean, culminating in Vasco da Gama's voyage of 1498, initiates a fundamental transformation of global commerce that strikes at the heart of Mamluk prosperity. For centuries, the Sultanate has derived much of its wealth from controlling the traditional trade routes that connect Asian producers with European consumers through Middle Eastern intermediaries. Spices, silk, precious stones, and exotic goods flow from India, Southeast Asia, and China through Red Sea ports into Egyptian markets, then continue overland to Mediterranean harbors where European merchants pay premium prices for Asian luxuries. The customs duties, transport fees, and commercial profits generated by this trade provide the fiscal foundation for Mamluk military power. The immediate impact of Portuguese competition appears manageable to contemporary observers. European ships carrying Asian goods directly to Lisbon cannot initially match the volume, variety, or reliability of traditional caravan routes. The new oceanic passages require months-long voyages through dangerous waters, while established Middle Eastern networks operate with proven efficiency accumulated over millennia. Yet the trend lines reveal a different story. Portuguese traders, freed from the markup imposed by multiple intermediaries, can offer Asian goods at prices that gradually undercut traditional suppliers. More importantly, they demonstrate that European powers need not depend on Islamic middlemen to access the wealth of the East, a realization that will eventually reshape global economic relationships. The Mamluk response reveals both sophisticated understanding of commercial realities and the structural limitations that prevent effective adaptation. Sultan Qaitbay negotiates with Venetian merchants to maintain existing trade patterns through preferential agreements and reduced fees. He dispatches embassies to European courts, warning that Portuguese competition threatens the stability of traditional commercial networks upon which all parties depend. The statistical evidence of declining prosperity accumulates gradually but inexorably. Customs receipts at Alexandria, the Sultanate's premier commercial port, begin declining in the early 16th century as European merchants increasingly source goods directly from Portuguese suppliers. The transit fees collected from caravan traffic across Egyptian territory similarly diminish as alternative routes reduce dependence on traditional pathways. Agricultural revenues, historically stable regardless of commercial fluctuations, begin experiencing irregularities that reflect broader economic disruption. Farmers who had supplemented agricultural income by providing services to trading caravans, fodder, accommodation, transport, and security, lose these additional revenue sources as commercial traffic declines. The urban crafts that had flourished under Mamluk patronage face competition from imported goods produced with techniques unknown to traditional Islamic artisans. European metalwork, textiles, and manufactured items increasingly appear in Middle Eastern markets, offering superior quality or lower prices than local products. The famous Mamluk workshops that had produced luxury goods for international markets find their customer base eroding. Perhaps most critically, the Sultanate fails to recognize that economic competition increasingly depends on technological innovation rather than traditional commercial advantages. The Portuguese success stems not merely from geographic discoveries, but from systematic application of new technologies. Improved navigation techniques, better shipbuilding methods, more effective firearms, and superior organizational systems. The Mamluk approach to technological adoption reflects cultural values that prioritize individual excellence over systematic innovation. While the Sultanate purchases advanced weapons and employs foreign technical specialists, it never develops indigenous capabilities for technological development. The same cultural emphasis on personal warrior skills that creates magnificent soldiers proves unsuitable for fostering the scientific and technical knowledge that modern warfare and economics increasingly require. The educational system that produces scholarly excellence in traditional Islamic disciplines, theology, law, literature, and philosophy, provides minimal training in mathematics, engineering, or empirical investigation. The madrasas, that had been sources of intellectual vitality during the Sultanate's golden age, become obstacles to adaptation as they perpetuate approaches to learning that no longer match contemporary needs. The economic decline accelerates military problems through feedback mechanisms that create vicious cycles of increasing weakness. Reduced revenues force cutbacks in military expenditure precisely when competition with the Ottomans demands increased investment in modern weapons and training. The Sultanate finds itself spending more on defense while achieving less military effectiveness. The recruitment system that depends on purchasing young slaves from Caucasian and Central Asian markets becomes increasingly expensive as demand from multiple Islamic states drives up prices. Meanwhile, the training costs for each individual Mamluk increase as military education must incorporate new techniques while maintaining traditional skills. The Iqta system that had provided stable funding for military households begins breaking down as agricultural revenues decline and commercial income becomes unreliable. Emirs, who had commanded wealth sufficient to maintain large military retinues, find themselves forced to reduce their forces precisely when external threats require expanded capabilities. The economic pressures create social tensions that compound political instability. Urban populations accustomed to prosperity based on commercial activity face unemployment and reduced living standards. The artisan classes that had supported Mamluk rule through political stability and tax payments increasingly view the government as ineffective protectors of their interests. Rural populations bear the burden of increased taxation designed to compensate for declining commercial revenues. The traditional balance between agricultural tribute and commercial wealth shifts toward greater reliance on farming communities that lack political influence to resist fiscal demands. Popular resentment accumulates even as the Sultanate's capacity to address grievances diminishes. The intellectual classes face particular challenges as traditional sources of patronage become unreliable. Scholars and religious figures who had depended on governmental and private support find their economic security threatened by broader fiscal problems. The cultural achievements that had distinguished Mamluk civilization begin declining as material resources for intellectual activity become scarce. The contrast with Ottoman adaptation becomes increasingly stark during this period. While the Mamluk Sultanate struggles to maintain traditional economic patterns in the face of changing global conditions, the Ottoman Empire systematically adapts its structures to exploit new opportunities. Turkish control over Balkan and Anatolian trade routes provides alternative revenue sources that partially compensate for changing Middle Eastern commercial patterns. More significantly, the Ottomans demonstrate willingness to modify traditional Islamic economic practices when strategic necessity demands innovation. Their systematic exploitation of European technological knowledge, combined with aggressive adaptation of new military and administrative techniques, creates competitive advantages that purely traditional approaches cannot match. The Ottoman fiscal system, based on comprehensive land surveys and systematic taxation rather than customary tribute arrangements, provides more predictable revenues and greater administrative flexibility. When economic conditions change, Turkish administrators can adjust their methods more rapidly than Mamluk officials constrained by traditional precedents and vested interests. By 1510, the Mamluk Sultanate faces an economic crisis that threatens its fundamental viability. The commercial revenues that had funded centuries of military dominance continue declining as global trade patterns shift away from traditional Middle Eastern roots. The technological innovations that drive this transformation remain beyond the Sultanate's adaptive capacity due to cultural and institutional constraints. Yet the full severity of the situation remains unclear to many contemporary observers. The Mamluk military continues winning occasional victories, the administrative system continues functioning despite fiscal stress, and the cultural achievements continue commanding international respect. The appearance of strength masks underlying weakness that will soon become apparent. The economic foundations of Mamluk power are crumbling, but the political superstructure built upon them has not yet collapsed. When that collapse comes, as it inevitably must, the speed and completeness of the fall will shock observers who had not recognized the depth of systemic vulnerability. The Sultanate stands at the edge of an abyss, maintained in apparent stability only by the momentum of past achievements and the reputation of historical greatness. The economic transformation of the early modern world has made traditional Middle Eastern commercial dominance obsolete, but the political and military structures built upon that dominance have not yet adapted to new realities. The stage is set for the final act of the Mamluk drama, a confrontation that will reveal whether military valor and cultural achievement can survive the destruction of their economic foundations, or whether even the most magnificent civilizations must ultimately yield to the inexorable forces of historical change. The rise of the Safavid dynasty in Persia after 1501 transforms the strategic landscape of the Middle East in ways that create both opportunities and dangers for the declining Mamluk Sultanate. The establishment of a militantly Shia state on the Ottoman's eastern border offers potential relief from Turkish pressure, but at the cost of allying with forces that challenge fundamental Sunni principles the Mamluks officially champion. Shah Ismail I, founder of Safavid power, presents himself as the divinely appointed champion of Ali's descendants and the rightful ruler of all Islamic territories. His armies sweep across Iran with the fervor of religious revolution, converting Sunni populations to Shia Islam through methods that range from persuasion to systematic persecution. The theological implications terrify Sunni authorities throughout the region. For Sultan Kansu al-Ghuri, who assumes Mamluk leadership in 1501, the Safavid emergence creates a diplomatic dilemma that perfectly illustrates the Sultanate's declining strategic position. Logic dictates alliance with any power capable of challenging Ottoman expansion, yet religious orthodoxy forbids cooperation with heretics whose beliefs threaten the theological foundations of Sunni Islam. The initial Mamluk response reveals the pragmatic calculations that increasingly drive Sultanate policy as survival takes precedence over ideological purity. Al-Ghuri opens diplomatic communications with Shah Ismail, while carefully avoiding any formal recognition of Safavid religious claims. The resulting relationship resembles a strategic partnership between powers that publicly maintain their doctrinal differences while privately coordinating against common enemies. The benefits of this arrangement become apparent during the Ottoman-Safavid conflicts that dominate the early 16th century. When Sultan Selim I launches his systematic campaign against Persian territories in 1514, Mamluk forces benefit from the diversion of Turkish resources that might otherwise threaten Egyptian security. The great Ottoman victory at Chaldiran demonstrates Turkish military superiority over traditional cavalry forces, but the campaign's costs prevent immediate expansion southward. Yet the Safavid alliance creates complications that ultimately prove more dangerous than the benefits it provides. Ottoman propaganda effectively portrays the Mamluks as collaborators with heretical Persians, undermining the Sultanate's claims to represent Sunni orthodoxy. More practically, the association with Shia power provides Selim with religious justification for aggressive action against Egypt that might otherwise require purely political motivations. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 provides both sides with lessons about modern warfare that will prove crucial in subsequent confrontations. The Safavid defeat demonstrates once more that traditional cavalry charges cannot succeed against disciplined firearms and artillery, while Ottoman victory confirms the effectiveness of combined arms tactics that integrate multiple weapons systems into unified battlefield doctrine. For Mamluk observers, the implications seem clear. Any future confrontation with Ottoman forces will require radical adaptation of traditional military methods or face inevitable defeat. Yet the cultural and institutional obstacles to such adaptation remain as formidable as ever. The warrior ethos that defines Mamluk identity continues to emphasize individual heroism over collective discipline, making the systematic changes necessary for military effectiveness psychologically difficult to accept. The intelligence networks that both empires maintain throughout the region provide detailed information about military innovations and tactical developments. Mamluk commanders study Ottoman methods with professional interest, while Turkish officers analyze Mamluk strengths and weaknesses with systematic thoroughness. The result is an arms race in military knowledge that favors the power with superior adaptive capacity. The Safavid relationship offers potential economic benefits that become increasingly important as traditional commercial revenues decline. Persian silk, a luxury commodity highly valued in European markets, provides an alternative source of customs income for territories controlling its transport routes. The possibility of redirecting Asian trade through Safavid Mamluk territories to bypass Ottoman-controlled pathways appeals to both strategic and fiscal considerations. Yet these economic opportunities remain largely theoretical due to geographical and political obstacles that prevent effective implementation. The overland routes connecting Persia with Mamluk territories pass through regions subject to Ottoman influence or direct control, making secure commercial transport difficult to guarantee. The naval alternatives require maritime capabilities that neither the Safavids nor the Mamluks possess in sufficient quantity to challenge established patterns. The broader economic transformation that affects all Middle Eastern powers continues regardless of local political arrangements. European access to Asian markets through oceanic routes reduces demand for traditional overland alternatives, while technological innovations in manufacturing create new forms of commercial competition that no Islamic state has successfully addressed. The triangular relationship between Ottoman, Safavid, and Mamluk powers creates diplomatic complications that extend far beyond bilateral arrangements. Each power seeks to prevent the others from forming alliances that might threaten its security, while simultaneously pursuing partnerships that might provide strategic advantages. The Ottomans prove most skillful at this complex diplomatic game, systematically isolating their enemies while building their own alliance networks. Selim. The first correspondence with European powers emphasizes shared opposition to Safavid heresy, while his communications with Sunni populations throughout Mamluk territories stress Turkish commitment to orthodox Islamic principles. Mamluk diplomatic responses reveal both sophisticated understanding of regional power dynamics and the fundamental weakness that constrains all their strategic options. Al-Ghuri's envoys to European courts propose anti-Ottoman coalitions based on shared interests in preventing Turkish expansion. Yet European powers prefer to see Islamic states weaken each other rather than strengthen any Muslim authority. The external pressures created by regional power competition exacerbate existing internal divisions within the Mamluk system. Military households split between those advocating accommodation with Ottoman power and others demanding resistance regardless of consequences. The ethnic divisions between different Mamluk groups acquire new significance as questions of loyalty become intertwined with religious and political considerations. The financial strains imposed by military competition and diplomatic necessities force increasingly desperate governmental measures. The debasement of currency accelerates as immediate needs take precedence over long-term monetary stability. Tax increases necessary to fund military preparations create popular resentment that ambitious rivals can exploit in their struggles for power. Perhaps most dangerously, the obvious success of Ottoman military and administrative methods creates psychological pressures that undermine confidence in traditional Mamluk approaches to governance and warfare. If Turkish innovations prove superior to established Islamic practices, what other aspects of the Sultanate system might require fundamental revision? The theological implications of the Safavid alliance create problems that extend beyond immediate political considerations. The Mamluk claim to represent authentic Sunni Islam becomes difficult to maintain when the Sultanate cooperates with powers that systematically persecute Sunni populations and promote doctrines condemned as heretical by orthodox authorities. Yet the alternatives appear equally problematic from religious perspectives. Ottoman claims to champion Sunni orthodoxy ring hollow when Turkish expansion threatens the independence of established Islamic states and subordinates religious authorities to dynastic political goals. The choice between heretical allies and orthodox enemies offers no theologically satisfactory resolution. The scholarly communities that had provided intellectual legitimacy for Mamluk rule find themselves caught between conflicting loyalties that cannot be easily reconciled. Support for the Sultanate against Ottoman expansion seems politically necessary, yet cooperation with Safavid heretics appears religiously unacceptable. The resulting intellectual paralysis contributes to broader cultural stagnation that weakens the system's adaptive capacity. By 1515, the regional balance of power has shifted decisively against Mamluk interests, despite temporary benefits from Safavid cooperation. The Ottoman Empire has demonstrated military capabilities that surpass anything traditional Islamic states can match, while its administrative efficiency and economic resources provide sustainable foundations for continued expansion. The Safavid alliance, despite its theoretical advantages, proves inadequate to address the fundamental challenges facing the Sultanate. Persian military weakness, revealed conclusively at Chaldiran, means that sheer resistance to Ottoman expansion cannot provide reliable strategic support. Meanwhile, the religious controversies created by the relationship with heretical allies undermine Mamluk claims to legitimate authority within the Sunni community. The diplomatic maneuvering that characterizes this period represents the Sultanate's last serious attempt to address its strategic predicament through traditional statecraft. The alliances, negotiations, and military preparations that consume so much governmental energy ultimately prove inadequate to resolve problems that require fundamental structural changes rather than tactical adjustments. The Mamluk Sultanate remains formidable by historical standards. Its armies still win occasional victories, its territories still generate substantial wealth, its cultural achievements still command international respect. Yet the gap between appearance and reality widens with each passing year as underlying weaknesses become increasingly difficult to conceal. The stage is set for the final confrontation that will determine whether the Sultanate can adapt to changing realities quickly enough to survive, or whether the forces of historical transformation have already made its destruction inevitable. The sword of Islam faces its ultimate test, and the outcome will reshape the entire Middle Eastern world. The year 1516 dawns with an ominous clarity that strips away all illusions about the Mamluk Sultanate's strategic position. Sultan Selim I, having consolidated Ottoman control over Anatolia and demonstrated Turkish military superiority against the Safavids, turns his attention southward with the systematic determination that has characterized his entire reign. The final confrontation between two Islamic empires becomes inevitable. The diplomatic exchanges that precede open warfare reveal the fundamental incompatibility between Ottoman and Mamluk conceptions of Islamic authority. Selim demands recognition as the legitimate successor to the Abbasid caliphs, claiming direct appointment from the last caliph in Ottoman custody. Al-Ghuri rejects these pretensions while asserting Mamluk rights as the historical defenders of Sunni orthodoxy and protectors of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Beyond these theological disputes lie practical considerations that make peaceful resolution impossible. The Ottomans require Egyptian wheat to feed Constantinople's growing population and Egyptian gold to fund continued military expansion. The Mamluks cannot surrender these resources without destroying the economic foundations of their own power. Two empires prepare to fight for stakes that neither can afford to lose. The Ottoman army that marches south in the summer of 1516 represents the culmination of Turkish military evolution. Selim commands perhaps 60,000 men organized in units that integrate traditional cavalry with janissary infantry, artillery corps, and engineering specialists. Most significantly, this force includes the largest concentration of firearms ever assembled by an Islamic power. Cannons, handguns, and support weapons that transform battlefield dynamics. The logistical achievement that enables this campaign rivals any military operation in medieval history. Supply trains stretch across hundreds of miles, providing ammunition, food, and equipment for an army operating far from its home territories. The administrative efficiency that makes such coordination possible reflects governmental capabilities that surpass anything the medieval world has previously seen. For the Mamluks, the approaching confrontation represents both existential threat and opportunity for redemption. Al-Ghuri assembles approximately 40,000 troops, including the elite Mamluk cavalry that has dominated Middle Eastern warfare for 2.5 centuries. Yet contemporary observers note troubling signs: factional disputes among commanders, inadequate firearms, and financial problems that prevent optimal military preparation. The strategic decisions that both commanders make reflect their understanding of the political as well as military dimensions of the conflict. Selim chooses to advance through Syria rather than attacking Egypt directly, recognizing that controlling the Levantine provinces will provide strategic depth while demonstrating Ottoman power to local populations who might otherwise resist Turkish rule. Al-Ghuri's response reveals both tactical sophistication and the constraints imposed by internal political considerations. Rather than defending from Egyptian fortifications where artillery might prove less decisive, he marches north to meet the Ottomans in Syria. This decision stems partly from military logic, preventing Ottoman consolidation of Syrian territories, and partly from political necessity, demonstrating that Mamluk leadership remains willing to fight for the Sultanate's claims. The two armies converge near Aleppo in a confrontation that will determine the fate of the medieval Islamic world. The battlefield of Marj Dabik, chosen by mutual agreement, provides terrain that favors neither side decisively, but allows both forces to deploy according to their preferred tactical doctrines. August 24, 1516 becomes one of history's most decisive dates as two military systems representing different approaches to Islamic power meet in direct confrontation. The battle begins with traditional cavalry charges that have dominated Middle Eastern warfare for centuries, but quickly evolves into something unprecedented in Islamic military experience. The Mamluk assault demonstrates all the qualities that had made their cavalry legendary: individual skill, tactical coordination, and magnificent courage in the face of overwhelming odds. These warriors, trained from boyhood in the arts of mounted warfare, execute their attacks with precision that earns Ottoman respect, even as their enemies prepare to destroy them. Yet courage cannot overcome technological superiority when the disparity reaches the levels present at Marj Dubik. Ottoman firearms, deployed with systematic coordination that integrates multiple weapon types into unified firing systems, devastate Mamluk formations with mechanical efficiency that no amount of individual heroism can counter. The death of Sultan al-Ghuri during the battle's climax symbolizes more than personal tragedy. It represents the end of an era in Islamic history. The old Sultan, fighting in the front ranks according to Mamluk tradition, falls not to enemy weapons, but to the strain of witnessing his life's work destroyed by forces that make traditional valor irrelevant. The psychological impact of their sultan's death shatters Mamluk morale as completely as Ottoman firepower breaks their military formations. The army that had seemed formidable at dawn dissolves into scattered remnants by afternoon, its survivors carrying news of disaster that will shock the entire Islamic world. Tumanbay, al-Ghuri's successor, attempts to rally resistance from Egyptian strongholds, but the strategic situation has become hopeless. Ottoman control of Syria cuts the Sultanate off from Asian trade routes, while Turkish naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean prevents effective communication with potential allies. The conquest of Egypt that follows demonstrates Ottoman administrative efficiency as clearly as the battle had revealed Turkish military superiority. Selim's forces advance down the Nile Valley with systematic organization that minimizes resistance while maximizing the preservation of valuable resources that will serve the expanding empire. The Battle of Ridaniya outside Cairo in January 1517 provides the final demonstration of technological warfare's triumph over traditional military methods. Tumanbay leads a desperate charge that embodies everything magnificent about Mamluk military culture: personal courage, tactical skill, and absolute devotion to duty. Yet these qualities, so decisive in earlier conflicts, prove inadequate against the mechanical efficiency of modern warfare. The execution of Tumanbay in April 1517 marks the official end of independent Mamluk rule, though scattered resistance continues for months. The last sultan dies with dignity that commands even his enemies' respect, but his death closes a chapter in Islamic history that had begun with the slaves who saved Islam at Ain Jalut. The speed and completeness of Ottoman victory shock observers throughout the contemporary world. An empire that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for 2.5 centuries disappears within 8 months of active campaigning. The military reputation built through victories against Mongols and Crusaders crumbles before technological innovations that make traditional warfare obsolete. Yet the human costs extend far beyond military casualties, to include the displacement of entire social classes whose existence had depended on Mamluk institutions. The military households that had governed Egypt and Syria for generations face systematic elimination as the Ottomans install their own administrative structures. Thousands of Mamluks die in battle or execution, while survivors face exile or subordination to Turkish authorities. The cultural implications prove equally devastating. The artistic workshops, scholarly institutions, and architectural projects that had flourished under Mamluk patronage lose their governmental support as Ottoman priorities replace traditional cultural values. The distinctive Mamluk artistic style, which had reached unprecedented heights during the 15th century, begins its gradual decline toward historical memory. The Ottoman conquest represents more than the replacement of one Islamic dynasty by another. It marks the transition from medieval to early modern patterns of political organization in the Middle East. The systematic governmental methods that enable Turkish success reflect new approaches to administration, warfare, and economic organization that will reshape the entire region. The technological revolution that proves so decisive at Marj Dabik and Ridania extends beyond military applications to encompass broader changes in manufacturing, transportation, and communication that no traditional government can effectively address. The Mamluk failure to adapt to these innovations foreshadows similar challenges that will face all established powers in an age of accelerating change. The fall of the Mamluk Sultanate follows patterns that recur throughout human history, the replacement of established systems by more adaptive alternatives when environmental conditions change beyond traditional institutions' capacity to adjust. The same military excellence that had ensured Mamluk success for centuries becomes a liability when warfare itself undergoes fundamental transformation. Yet the speed of this transformation suggests that historical change itself may be accelerating in ways that make traditional approaches to governance increasingly obsolete. The early modern world demands institutional flexibility that few medieval systems possess, creating pressures that will eventually affect all established powers, regardless of their historical achievements. The sword that had defended Islam for 2.5 centuries finally breaks against forces that no amount of courage or skill can overcome. The Sultanate that began with slaves who became kings ends with kings who become historical memory, their glory preserved in chronicles, but their power transferred to successors who better understand the demands of a changing world. The immediate aftermath of Ottoman conquest cannot mask the profound historical significance of the Mamluk experiment in Islamic governance. For 267 years, from 1250 to 1517, former slaves had ruled one of the world's great empires, creating precedents and achievements that would influence Islamic civilization for centuries beyond their political demise. The institutional innovations that the Mamluks developed to solve the practical problems of governing diverse populations across vast territories provided models that subsequent Islamic states would adapt to their own circumstances. The Iqta system of military land grants, the sophisticated bureaucratic structures that administered complex economies, and the educational institutions that produced both religious scholars and government officials all survived Ottoman conquest in modified forms. More significantly, the Mamluk demonstration that military merit could legitimately supersede hereditary authority challenged traditional concepts of Islamic rulership in ways that would resonate throughout the early modern period. If slaves could become sultans through proven capability, then political authority need not depend on tribal affiliations, ethnic identities, or dynastic claims, a revolutionary concept in societies that had traditionally assumed divine ordination of existing hierarchies. The cultural achievements of the Mamluk period established artistic and intellectual standards that continued influencing Islamic civilization long after the Sultanate's political collapse. The distinctive architectural style that reached full maturity during the 14th and 15th centuries, characterized by sophisticated geometric patterns, innovative structural techniques, and harmonious integration of decorative and functional elements, inspired builders throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The manuscript illumination traditions developed in Mamluk workshops set aesthetic standards that later Islamic artists struggled to equal. The intricate geometric designs, sophisticated calligraphic techniques, and innovative use of color and space created visual languages that communicated cultural values across linguistic and ethnic boundaries. These artistic innovations spread throughout the Islamic world, influencing traditions as distant as Andalusian Spain and Mughal India. Perhaps most enduringly, the historical chronicles produced by Mamluk scholars preserve detailed records of medieval Islamic civilization that remain invaluable sources for modern historians. Writers like al-Makrizi, Ibn Taghribirdi, and al-Sakhawi created comprehensive accounts of political events, social conditions, and cultural developments that provide insights into medieval Middle Eastern life unavailable from any other sources. The military innovations that had made Mamluk cavalry the finest heavy horsemen of their age continued influencing warfare throughout the Islamic world, even as gunpowder weapons made traditional tactics obsolete. The systematic training methods that produced individual warriors of extraordinary skill provided educational models that military academies adapted to new technologies and changing tactical requirements. The fortification techniques developed during centuries of Crusader and Mongol warfare influenced defensive architecture throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Mamluk engineers had pioneered innovations in castle design, siege warfare, and urban fortification that proved their value in countless conflicts. These military engineering advances spread throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond, contributing to the defensive capabilities of Islamic states facing European expansion. More abstractly, the Mamluk demonstration that disciplined military organization could overcome seemingly superior enemies provided inspiration for later Islamic reformers facing technological disadvantages. The example of former slaves defeating Mongol armies and expelling Crusader states suggested that military excellence based on systematic training and institutional discipline could compensate for material disadvantages, a lesson that would prove relevant in many subsequent conflicts. The commercial networks that had sustained Mamluk prosperity for centuries survived political transition to continue facilitating trade between Asian producers and European consumers. The infrastructure of roads, ports, markets, and financial institutions that the Sultanate had developed provided foundations for continued economic activity under Ottoman administration. The agricultural techniques that had enabled Egyptian and Syrian farmers to support large urban populations and extensive military establishments continued generating surplus production that funded imperial expansion and cultural achievement. The irrigation systems, crop rotation methods, and land management practices developed during the Mamluk period remained essential to regional prosperity for centuries after the conquest. Perhaps most significantly, the demonstration that systematic governmental intervention could enhance commercial prosperity provided models for later Islamic states seeking to maximize the economic potential of their territories. The Mamluk combination of military protection, legal consistency, and administrative efficiency created conditions for commercial growth that subsequent governments attempted to replicate. The scholarly institutions established under Mamluk patronage continued functioning as centers of Islamic learning long after political control passed to Ottoman hands. The madrasas of Cairo and Damascus maintained their reputations for educational excellence, producing generations of religious scholars, legal experts, and government officials who shaped Islamic intellectual development throughout the early modern period. The theological and legal scholarship that flourished under Mamluk sponsorship established interpretations of Islamic law that influenced judicial decisions throughout the Sunni world. Scholars like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and al-Suyuti created works of religious commentary and legal analysis that remained standard references for centuries, shaping Islamic thought far beyond the territorial boundaries of the former Sultanate. The historical and geographical scholarship produced during the Mamluk period preserved knowledge about medieval Islamic civilization that proved invaluable to later generations of scholars and administrators. The comprehensive surveys of Islamic history, detailed descriptions of Middle Eastern geography, and systematic collections of biographical information created by Mamluk intellectuals provided essential resources for subsequent research and writing. The social mobility that characterized Mamluk society, despite its basis in slavery, demonstrated possibilities for advancement based on merit that challenged traditional assumptions about social hierarchy. The regular elevation of talented individuals from humble origins to positions of authority created precedents that influenced social development throughout the Islamic world. The integration of diverse ethnic groups within unified military and administrative structures provided models for governing multicultural populations that proved relevant to many subsequent Islamic empires. The Mamluk success in creating loyalty that transcended tribal and ethnic affiliations suggested approaches to imperial unity that later rulers attempted to adapt to their own circumstances. The urban culture that developed in Mamluk cities, characterized by sophisticated commercial activities, elaborate cultural institutions, and complex social relationships, established patterns of metropolitan life that influenced urban development throughout the Middle East. The great cities of the Mamluk period, Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, remained important cultural centers long after political authority passed to other hands. The Mamluk experience provides valuable comparative material for understanding the dynamics of political change in medieval and early modern societies. The Sultanate's rise from desperate defensive alliance to dominant regional power illustrates how military excellence can create political opportunities when strategic circumstances favor adaptive innovation over traditional approaches. Conversely, the Mamluk failure to adapt to technological and economic changes that made traditional military advantages obsolete demonstrates how success itself can create institutional rigidities that prevent necessary adaptation. The very cultural values and organizational structures that enabled the Sultanate's initial triumph ultimately became obstacles to the flexibility required for survival in changing circumstances. The speed with which Mamluk power collapsed once technological and economic advantages shifted decisively against traditional methods suggests broader patterns in historical change that extend beyond the specific circumstances of 16th century Islamic politics. The acceleration of technological innovation that characterizes the early modern period created pressures for institutional adaptation that challenged all established governments, regardless of their previous achievements. The Mamluk example continues providing insights relevant to contemporary discussions about political legitimacy, social mobility, and institutional adaptation in rapidly changing environments. The Sultanate's demonstration that effective governance can emerge from sources traditionally considered unlikely or illegitimate suggests possibilities for political development that remain relevant to modern circumstances. The systematic educational and training methods that produced the Mamluk military elite offer models for institutional approaches to human development that transcend their historical context. The combination of rigorous selection, comprehensive education, and systematic advancement based on demonstrated competence created human resources that enabled achievements far beyond what traditional recruitment methods might have accomplished. Perhaps most poignantly, the Mamluk legacy preserves the memory of a unique experiment in human organization, the transformation of military slaves into the champions of Islamic civilization. The boys torn from their families in distant lands who became the defenders of the faith represent individual tragedies that created collective triumph, personal suffering that enabled cultural achievement. Their monuments still stand in the cities they ruled, mosques, madrasas, and mausoleums that testify to the grandeur they created from unpromising beginnings. The geometric patterns carved in stone, the calligraphic inscriptions praising their achievements, and the architectural innovations that house their remains speak across centuries to honor memory that deserves preservation. The Mamluk Sultanate ended as all earthly powers must, but its legacy endures in the institutions it created, the precedents it established, and the human possibilities it demonstrated. From the ashes of the Abbasid Caliphate, slaves built an empire. When that empire fell, it left foundations upon which others could build. The story of the Mamluks reminds us that human potential can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that institutional innovation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that even fallen civilizations can contribute to the continuing development of human society. Their rise and fall illuminates both the possibilities and limitations of human ambition in the face of historical change. As we draw toward the end of our journey through nearly 3 centuries of Mamluk history, the patterns that emerge from this extraordinary tale speak to fundamental questions about power, adaptation, and survival that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of medieval Islamic politics. The transformation of military slaves into the rulers of one of history's great empires challenges every assumption we might hold about the sources of political legitimacy and the possibilities of human advancement. These boys, purchased in distant markets and trained in Egyptian barracks, created governmental institutions that would influence Islamic civilization for centuries, military innovations that would reshape medieval warfare, and cultural achievements that continue commanding admiration today. Yet their ultimate failure to adapt to changing technological and economic conditions demonstrates that no amount of past achievement can guarantee future survival when fundamental circumstances undergo revolutionary transformation. The same qualities that made the Mamluks successful for 2.5 centuries, military excellence, institutional loyalty, and cultural confidence, became liabilities when the early modern world demanded flexibility, technological adaptation, and economic innovation. The speed with which Mamluk power collapsed once decisive advantages shifted to their enemies suggests broader truths about historical change that remain relevant to contemporary circumstances. In an age of accelerating technological development and global economic integration, the Mamluk experience provides sobering lessons about the dangers of institutional rigidity and the necessity of continuous adaptation. Modern nations face challenges analogous to those that confronted the Mamluk Sultanate: the need to maintain military security while adapting to technological change, the requirement to preserve cultural identity while engaging with global economic systems, and the necessity of balancing traditional values with innovative approaches to emerging problems. The Mamluk success in creating meritocratic advancement within hierarchical structures offers insights relevant to contemporary debates about social mobility and institutional reform. Their demonstration that systematic education and training can enable individuals to transcend the circumstances of their birth suggests possibilities for human development that remain applicable regardless of technological or social change. The relationship between the Mamluk Sultanate and the broader Islamic world illuminates patterns of cultural interaction and political development that extend beyond their historical period. Their role as defenders of Sunni orthodoxy against Mongol paganism and later as champions of Islamic independence against Ottoman expansion demonstrates how religious and political identities can reinforce each other in ways that create both strength and vulnerability. The cultural achievements that flourished under Mamluk patronage, architecture, literature, scholarship, and artistic production illustrate how political stability and economic prosperity can create conditions for human creativity that outlast the governments that sponsor them. The monuments they built and the intellectual traditions they fostered continued enriching Islamic civilization long after their political authority ended. Their military innovations, particularly their synthesis of traditional cavalry tactics with emerging gunpowder technologies, demonstrate both the possibilities and limitations of adaptive innovation within established institutional frameworks. The Mamluks proved capable of incorporating new techniques when they supplemented existing strengths, but struggled to make fundamental changes that would have required abandoning core identity elements. The economic foundations of Mamluk power, control over traditional trade routes between Asia and Europe, provided wealth sufficient to sustain centuries of military and cultural achievement, but their inflexibility when global commerce underwent fundamental transformation contributed directly to the Sultanate's downfall. The Portuguese discovery of oceanic routes to Asian markets represented the kind of paradigm shift that renders traditional advantages obsolete, regardless of how effectively they had previously been exploited. The Mamluk failure to develop alternative economic foundations when their traditional sources of revenue came under pressure illustrates the importance of economic diversification and adaptive capacity in maintaining long-term viability. Modern economies face analogous challenges as technological innovation creates new industries while making traditional sectors obsolete. The Mamluk experience suggests that successful adaptation requires not merely adopting new technologies, but fundamentally rethinking the institutional structures and cultural assumptions that supported previous approaches. The evolution of Mamluk military power from defensive desperation through offensive dominance to ultimate defeat provides insights into the dynamics of strategic competition that remain relevant to contemporary security challenges. Their initial success stemmed from superior training, institutional discipline, and strategic innovation that enabled them to defeat enemies with apparent advantages. Their period of dominance reflected their ability to maintain military excellence while expanding their resource base and eliminating potential threats through systematic campaign planning and diplomatic maneuvering. Their final defeat resulted from their inability to adapt fundamental military approaches when technological change made traditional methods obsolete. The lesson for modern military organizations lies not in specific tactical innovations, but in the broader patterns of institutional adaptation and cultural flexibility that determine whether established powers can maintain their advantages when strategic environments undergo rapid change. The Mamluk example suggests that military excellence requires continuous innovation rather than reliance on proven methods. The social mobility that characterized Mamluk society, despite its foundation in slavery, created possibilities for individual advancement that challenged traditional hierarchical assumptions while preserving institutional stability. Their success in integrating diverse ethnic groups within unified military and administrative structures demonstrates approaches to managing diversity that remain relevant to multicultural societies. The educational institutions that produced both military commanders and civilian administrators created human resources that enabled achievement far beyond what their origins might have suggested. The systematic nature of Mamluk training programs, combining practical skills with cultural education and institutional loyalty, offers models for contemporary approaches to human development. Their cultural achievements, artistic, architectural, and intellectual, demonstrate how political patronage can create conditions for creativity that enrich human civilization regardless of the political systems that sponsor them. The endurance of Mamluk cultural contributions long after their political authority ended suggests the importance of investing in human creativity and cultural development. The challenges that faced the late Mamluk Sultanate, technological disruption, economic transformation, military competition, and internal political division, mirror issues that confront contemporary governments, attempting to maintain stability and effectiveness in rapidly changing environments. The rise of new powers with innovative approaches to military, economic, and political organization parallels contemporary situations where established nations face challenges from competitors employing different institutional models and technological capabilities. The Mamluk experience suggests that responding effectively to such challenges requires fundamental adaptation rather than merely tactical adjustments. The internal divisions that weakened Mamluk capacity to respond to external threats illustrate how domestic political conflicts can create vulnerabilities that external enemies can exploit. The importance of maintaining internal unity while adapting to changing circumstances remains a central challenge for any political system facing existential pressures. The Mamluk story raises profound questions about the nature of historical change and human agency that extend beyond the specific circumstances of medieval Islamic politics. Their rise from slavery to imperial power demonstrates the potential for human achievement under even the most unpromising circumstances, while their eventual fall illustrates the limitations of individual and institutional capacity when confronted with forces beyond their control. The tension between preserving cultural identity and adapting to changing circumstances that characterize their later period reflects dilemmas that face all societies attempting to maintain continuity while responding to external pressures for change. The Mamluk experience suggests that survival requires finding ways to modify institutional structures while preserving essential values and identity elements. Their example also illustrates how historical change can accelerate in ways that challenge traditional approaches to governance and social organization. The early modern period created pressures for adaptation that exceeded the capacity of many medieval institutions, foreshadowing contemporary situations where technological and social change occurs at rates that strain existing systems. As we conclude this examination of Mamluk rise and fall, we should remember that behind the institutional analysis and strategic assessments lie human stories of remarkable courage, achievement, and tragedy. The boys who became slaves, the slaves who became warriors, the warriors who became rulers, and the rulers who became historical memory represent individual lives that collectively created one of history's most extraordinary experiments in human organization. Their monuments still stand in the cities they ruled, their artistic achievements continue inspiring admiration, and their historical example continues providing insights into the possibilities and limitations of human ambition. The geometric patterns they carved in stone speak across centuries of mathematical precision and aesthetic vision. The mosques they built continue sheltering worshippers whose prayers echo those of their builders. The manuscripts they illuminated preserve knowledge that enriches contemporary understanding of medieval Islamic civilization. But perhaps their greatest monument is the demonstration that human potential can transcend the circumstances of origin, that systematic education and institutional discipline can enable extraordinary achievement, and that even fallen civilizations contribute to the continuing development of human society. The story of the Mamluk Sultanate, from the desperate defenders of Ain Jalut to the fallen warriors of Marj Dabik, encompasses themes that transcend the boundaries of time and geography. It is a story of transformation and adaptation, of triumph and tragedy, of the endless human struggle to build something permanent in the face of inevitable change. For 2 centuries and 67 years, former slaves ruled one of the world's great empires. They saved Islamic civilization from Mongol destruction, expelled the last Crusaders from the Holy Land, and created cultural achievements that continue enriching human heritage. Their rise from bondage to imperial power demonstrates possibilities for human advancement that inspire hope across all historical circumstances. Yet their fall reminds us that no achievement, however magnificent, can guarantee permanent survival when fundamental conditions change beyond institutional capacity to adapt. The technological and economic transformations of the early modern period created challenges that proved beyond the Mamluk system's ability to address, despite centuries of previous success. The boys purchased in Caucasian slave markets became the champions of Islam, The military households that competed for dominance created governmental institutions that influenced Islamic civilization for centuries. The sultans who ruled from Cairo and Damascus left monuments that still inspire wonder at human creativity and ambition. Their story belongs not merely to Islamic history or medieval studies, but to the broader human experience of rising to meet challenges, adapting to changing circumstances, and ultimately yielding to forces greater than individual will or institutional capacity can overcome. In the museums of Cairo and Damascus, in the libraries that preserve their chronicles, in the monuments that survived Ottoman conquest and modern development, the Mamluks live on as testament to human potential and historical complexity. Their legacy reminds us that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely sources, that institutions can transcend their origins through systematic development, and that even fallen civilizations contribute to the ongoing story of human achievement. The spring of Goliath, where it all began, still flows in the hills of Palestine. The Nile continues its eternal journey toward the sea, carrying the memories of the empire that rose and fell along its banks. And in the geometric patterns of mosque decorations, the precision of historical chronicles, and the inspiration drawn from their example, the Mamluks continue their march through history, no longer as rulers, but as reminders of what human beings can accomplish when necessity demands greatness. From slaves to sultans, from defenders to conquerors, from triumph to defeat, the Mamluk Sultanate stands as one of history's most remarkable experiments in human organization. Their rise saved Islamic civilization. Their achievements enriched human culture. Their fall teaches lessons that remain relevant to any age that faces the challenge of adaptation in times of fundamental change. The sword of Islam has been sheathed, but the story it wrote in the chronicles of human experience continues inspiring all who seek to understand how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when history demands heroes. This has been the story of the rise and fall of the Mamluk state, a tale of former slaves who became the champions of their age and whose memory continues lighting the path for those who would dare to transform the circumstances of their birth into legacies worthy of remembrance. The Mamluk Sultanate ruled from 1250 to 1517 CE, spanning 267 years of Islamic history. Their territories at maximum extent included Egypt, Syria, Palestine, parts of Anatolia, and the Hejaz region containing the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Major sources for this documentary include the chronicles of al-Makrizi, Ibn Tagribirdi, al-Sakhawi, and other contemporary historians, supplemented by archaeological evidence and modern scholarship from leading universities and research institutions worldwide. The geometric patterns, architectural monuments, and artistic achievements of the Mamluk period continue to inspire admiration and study. Their historical example provides insights into the dynamics of political change, cultural development, and institutional adaptation that remain relevant to contemporary circumstances. For those interested in further exploration of this remarkable period in Islamic history, extensive bibliographies and primary source materials are available through academic institutions and specialized libraries throughout the world. The memory of the Mamluks lives on in the monuments they built, the knowledge they preserved, and the example they set for all who would seek to transform personal limitation into collective achievement. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.